Good afternoon on this rainy day. I'm Husain Haqqani. I'm Director for South and Central Asia here at the Hudson Institute. Today we are discussing the peace process in Afghanistan, which comes 2 years after President Trump announced that his Afghanistan and South Asia strategy would be to try and create circumstances for an eventual American withdrawal, but not with a timeline. And then later on, the US started a peace process of direct talks with the Taliban. We are now seeing a stage in which that peace process is suspended. But can that peace process be revived? Is that the only path forward? Is the American media right in characterizing that, since this war has gone on for 18 years, therefore it is an unwinnable war? Those are the issues that we hope to discuss today with what I think is a very interesting and good and diverse panel. We have Ambassador Ronald Neumann, President of the American Academy of Diplomacy and former US Ambassador to Afghanistan. He's a former career Foreign Service officer. He has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and is the author of several books, including The Other War, Winning and Losing in Afghanistan. Next to him, to my right, is Bill Roggio, who is Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. Bill was embedded with the US Marine Corps, the US Army, and Iraqi forces in Iraq between 2005 and 2008, and with the Canadian Army in Afghanistan in 2006. So between Ambassador Neumann and Bill, we have both the diplomatic and the military exposure of the American side in Afghanistan. And then farthest to my right, not politically of course, is Javid Ahmad, who is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council South Asia Center and a non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point, where he focuses on pressing security, violent extremism, socioeconomic and peace-related issues in South Asia, mainly Afghanistan and Pakistan. Javid has also served as a senior advisor to the Afghan government, focusing on counterterrorism, anti-money laundering, and countering the financing of terrorism. Javid, of course, is of Afghan heritage. So let's get started, folks. Ambassador Neumann, my first question to you. There are always these comparisons with Vietnam. Everybody says 18 years, very long war. Why do you think that we have not been able to have either a military or a political solution? Or to put it differently, why hasn't America won decisively, quickly enough for everybody to declare victory and celebrate?
That is our paradigm, isn't it? I think we could all talk a long time about mistakes made, things might have been, but I think there are perhaps two things to say quickly and answer your question, because this is sort of the bumper, you have a more sophisticated version of the bumper sticker question, why can't you see this won't work if you can't do it in 18 years? To which I like to point out to people that there is no it which we have not done in 18 years. We have had, by my count, 9 policies in Afghanistan. 2 under Bush, 5 under Obama, 2 under Trump, which means our problem is that we can't do any one thing for 3 years. And that is a terribly bad way to go about a war of this kind, because it means that you never have credibility for whatever you say you're doing now, because people wait for you to change. We added to that lack of credibility in the Obama years by being absolutely fixated on dates by which we were going to leave or do something, dates which never had any relevance to things on the ground. And there, I could say one particular thing, because the biggest part of Obama's decision of 2009, late 2009, was to build up the Afghan forces. And it's really important to realize we had our major troop surge on the ground in full force only for 3 years. We decided we're going to build more than double size of the army in a primitive country. We gave it lots of money, lots of stuff. We never gave it enough time, and we never gave it enough people, so that we were never over 50% of the, except for 1 year, of the NATO requirement for training forces. And yet in 3 years, we wanted to pull out. And we did it rather rapidly. There are a lot of other things one could say, but constantly changing the strategy, constantly adjusting, depriving yourself of any credibility while under-resourcing critical elements of the policy are a good piece of it. They're not, they're operational, if you will. They're larger strategic pieces. You asked me about, you mentioned Vietnam, and I won't spend a lot of time on that, but a lot of people like to talk about, well, it's just like Vietnam. You know, it's far away, it's long-lasting, and there's a lot of corrupt government, all of which is true. But as one of the few people around who actually served in Vietnam as well, that's a long time ago, you know, there's some interesting...
You were a young man then, you're a young man now.
I like your optimism. In any
I have to be optimistic about something, Ron.
Yes, that's good, that's true. In any event, there are some very interesting differences, I think, that are worth noting, although they don't guarantee anything. One is, of course, you've had, despite political controversy, you've had peaceful changes of power in Afghanistan, where you had multiple coups violently in Vietnam. Recently, there were two laws in Afghanistan which removed over 3,500 generals and colonels who were over age in the military. I asked Rufus Phillips, who a few of you might be old enough to know was a name to conjure with in Vietnam, had anything like that ever happened in Vietnam? The answer was no. Doesn't mean the Army's going to be perfectly reformed, but it's an interesting difference. And one of the most striking differences, I think, is that Vietnam never had a leader with any sense of vision or the future. Now, there are a lot of things one may dislike about Ashraf Ghani, but he certainly is a person with a view of institutional development. None of those differences mean Afghanistan will go well or Vietnam didn't. I'm not saying that. It's just this bumper sticker, it's just like this, doesn't happen to be true.
Well, and there is, of course, a huge difference in the nature of the two countries and the nature of American involvement. The American involvement in Vietnam came after French rule, and you were more or less taking over from the French, so any resentment against the French transferred on to you, whereas in case of Afghanistan, you really had a reason to go in, which was to try and deprive the terrorist groups that had attacked America on 9/11 of a safe haven. So you had a greater level of
and a very different enemy. For all that the Taliban have sanctuaries in Pakistan, the end of the Vietnam War was an invasion of 20 divisions, including armor. The Taliban do not dispose of armored divisions.
Sure. Bill, you have you were critical of the process, the peace process as it was proceeding. You have often also been critical of the way the war has been conducted. You have, of course, served in the military, so you've seen it from this point of view of the fighter and the fighting man. And of course, the American troops have acquitted them very well as soldiers in the war. The problem seems to be in the political decision-making, as Ambassador Neumann pointed out, 9 policies in 18 years. So if you keep changing policies with an enemy like the Taliban, whose leader, founding leader, Mullah Omar used to say, the Americans have watches, we have the time. So here are people who are just basically trying to wait you out. And if they know that your policy is going to be a 2-year cycle or a 4-year cycle, then it's easier to wait out. So how do you see the US actually changing course and finding the right mix of diplomatic and military tools to bring this war to an end that would achieve the war aims rather than just meet some arbitrary deadline?
Yeah, I'm actually quite pessimistic on US chances in Afghanistan at this point. I think this war actually is lost, and we're at the point now where we're preparing for withdrawal. The entire point of the so-called peace talks really was to facilitate the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan. We are dealing with an enemy that we know is allied with al-Qaeda, that refuses to renounce al-Qaeda, an enemy that's backed with by Pakistan. One of the problems, to me, the biggest problem in this war, whether our failure to 9 different policies, timetables. We've never dealt with the real problem, which is Pakistan's state sponsorship and the safe haven across the border. So until we're prepared to deal with that, and I think there are ways to do that, this war will be lost. And there is no political will for that, unfortunately. It would take I don't think either on the Republican or the Democratic side of the aisle, everyone's talking withdrawal. It's just a matter of how we withdraw, how we disengage from Afghanistan. I don't understand the point of peace talks with the Taliban when you can't trust them. This is a very untrustworthy group. As they're negotiating with the United States, they released a video of where they actually blame the United States. They called the 9/11 attacks a dark slap on the face of the United States, and they said we deserved it. This is as they're conducting peace talks. These are individuals who, or a group that we think or we're pretending could police al-Qaeda, but that's not the case. So when we're in this mindset of we need to leave, I don't see any way to walk this back. President Trump is very clear that he wants to leave. I don't know anyone on the Democrat side of the aisle that is willing to double down in Afghanistan and do what's necessary. And so therefore, you know, like I said, I had this view that this war was lost 4 years ago. I think it was quite evident then, and it's only become even more so now. It's just a matter of how we lose. And the reason I'm a big opponent for these peace talks, so-called, again, I'll call them withdrawal talks, is because several things. We're going to legitimize the Taliban. We're delegitimizing the Afghan government. The Taliban has said in its statements it does not, it is fundamentally disagrees with democracy. I could put these statements up on the screen if you like. It's fighting for religious motivations, not just in Afghanistan, by the way. It has the same rhetoric that al-Qaeda has. Democracy is against everything that Islam stands for, and it's for the Ummah, which is the
Taliban.
I'm sorry.
According to the Taliban.
Yeah, according to the Taliban, yes. The Muslim Ummah, or the Muslim community, must stand up and fight against democracy. This is the Taliban's official position, which they publish in 5 different languages on its website, Voice of Jihad.
Let me interrupt you just for a second, Bill. So as I understand you, what you're saying is that the way we are going, we are heading towards losing this war, but you also are saying that this is not a war we should lose because it has implications for our security.
Absolutely. It has direct implications. Just last week, we raided an al-Qaeda stronghold in a place called Musakel in Helmand province. And the only reason we found out about it, these things are happening. We just don't know. The only reason we found out about this raid is because civilians were killed and a big stink was killed. They captured the head of al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. They captured his wife and his direct courier to Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's the head of al-Qaeda. Now, do we think that the Taliban is going to break with al-Qaeda when we have this type of action going on as peace talks are happening? With that, you know, it's very frustrating to watch this process. A victory for the Taliban will be a victory for al-Qaeda. It will incentivize the Pakistani state's sponsorship of other terrorist groups, of using terrorism as a tool of its own foreign policy. In Afghanistan, they call that strategic depth by supporting the Taliban. So it's important that the U.S. stay and fight. I will say this, it's hard for me to argue against the will of the President of the United States and pretty much the will of the American public, because I don't know of any politician out there, or at least there's no majority out there to stay in Afghanistan. So if we want to leave Afghanistan, there's no obligation to cut a deal with the Taliban. There's no obligation to legitimize them. We can leave on our own terms.
No deal exit.
No deal exit should be the option. And if I would leave a calling card with Pakistan and let them know what happens if you continue to sponsor the Taliban. We know where these Taliban training camps, where they're recruiting centers, where they're hospitals, where they're madrasas. We know all of this information. We just refuse to act on it because we want to pretend Pakistan is our ally when they are in fact our enemy.
Okay, Javid, you of course have been in Afghanistan recently. Elections were held only over the last weekend. By and large, not as bad in terms of security situation, but politically, a low turnout, which basically means a lot of people were either scared or disinterested. And a bit of a sigh of relief on the part of the Afghan government that these talks didn't go through the way they were going, because many of us felt that the Afghan government had been totally bypassed. And the idea was to have a deal. And as Bill said, I have also written that, Ambassador Neumann and many other former American ambassadors have said that a deal which basically respectabilized and legitimized the Taliban without making anything really conditional on them was not necessary, even for an American withdrawal. Walk us through what you think is the situation in Afghanistan right now, both politically and security-wise.
Sure. First of all, thank you. Secondly, yes, so there were elections on Saturday, and it was wartime elections. And holding elections during wartime is no small feat, especially knowing that, or considering the fact that up until a few weeks ago, we did not even know whether the elections will actually take place or not. But at any rate, the elections that were held on Saturday were in the campaign that preceded that vote were basically a referendum on two fundamental issues, and that was Afghanistan's present and then Afghanistan's past. And so the proposition to the Afghan public was very clear, whether to stick to the present, however sort of dysfunctional and unwieldy that present may be, or revert back to the distasteful past. And I think by braving the Taliban threats, open threats, essentially embracing it and going to cast their votes, the Afghan people made their choice that they want this sort of the present, this constitutional republic. And it's now up to the Afghan leaders whether or not they can keep it. In the lead up to the vote, there were several concerns with respect to the elections. I'll highlight maybe three. The first one was that the technology will fail us. The second one was, of course, the security, that there will be high-profile security attacks or many-fold attacks that's going to disrupt the election overall. And then the third one was the possibility for some kind of industrial-level fraud that's going to taint the legitimacy and the credibility of the vote as a whole. And that we will see it in social media, people basically tossing around snapshots of it. But despite certain irregularities, again, this was a wartime election, none of those
irregularity is not more than what one would have in a Louisiana or a North Carolina election or Florida, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not comparable, but yes, I mean, you could say that. But from a technical side, it was a very good election since the first election in 2004. And this is basically the general perception on the ground, and I've spoken to several Western diplomats on the ground since Saturday, and they've actually said the same thing. From a political side, there seems to be a low turnout, as you said, Ambassador, earlier, and that's maybe one of the concerns. And it's possible that the turnout right now is between 2.5 to 3 million people. About 9.6 million people had registered. But we need to consider the circumstances for why there was this sort of low turnout, including, again, the Taliban threats, but also the fact that we didn't know up until a few weeks ago whether the election would happen, and also because the candidates did not even bother to campaign until 2 weeks ago, except for maybe like one or two of them. Geographically speaking, the turnout was low in the north, northeast, and then the northwest area, mainly because of the Taliban attacks. The turnout was relatively better in the south, southeast, and southeastern areas, but low turnout has nothing to do with the credibility of the vote or the legitimacy of the vote itself. Now, which candidate is leading, from what I've heard internally, is that the votes fully are not tabulated yet. We haven't seen the results yet, but the initial data shows that President Haqqani will likely pick about 56% of the vote, and again, that's projection. And if he picks that up, that's going to give him a comfortable sort of victory in the first round. And this is followed by Dr. Abdullah, who's another sort of front runner, and likely going to pick about 30% of the overall vote. But we will know. I mean, again, these are projections, but the initial results are not out yet, and it's going to be out October 19, and then the final results November 7th. On the political responses so far to the vote itself, Ahmad, which is one of the sort of local strongmen, who's a close supporter of Dr. Abdullah, he released two statements saying that the initial results show that the election has a winner in the first round and that everyone should accept it. And they also discourage people, which is sort of very unlikely for a person like Ahmad to avoid staging protest. He also sort of took a swipe at Dr. Abdullah himself, saying that he
his own running mate,
his former ally, now that he should accept the results and not create unnecessary tensions. Now we'll see what the Independent Election Commission, the Electoral Complaint Commission, is going to say. But Dr. Abdullah has already come out. He has declared victory, and this is not his prerogative to be declaring victory before the IEC comes out and says that the votes are fully counted and this is the result. But overall, I think the Afghan security forces did a phenomenal job. They had a dual responsibility of both providing security to the polling sites, but also encouraging people to come out and vote. Now, there were also security incidents across the country, in tens of them. Resulted in the deaths of a little over 100 people, and that's a price that the Afghans actually openly embrace to pay. But we'll see right now. Now, at the end of the day, I think the Afghan people were the winners.
Peace process. Does the election have any implications for it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What are they?
So one of the direct implications is that the elections will give any president that's going to come, whether it's President Abdullah or President Ghani, a renewed mandate to come in with a sort of much stronger voice and then engage in peace talks directly with the Taliban. It's also going to give them the credibility because up until now, President Ghani, for example, was seen as a lame duck president, and he was often sort of touted in public and in private by his partners, close partners in regional countries, that the agency he asserts he doesn't have that kind of sort of political backing to back it up. This time, the next president will have that agency to engage with that authority with the Taliban and sit down and say, okay, this is our plan. And I think they have a roadmap to peace, but they're open to they don't have a fixed position, maybe a fixed position on the Republic, but they're open to hard compromises.
They're willing to compromise on including the Taliban into the Afghan Republic that has been created over the last 17, 18 years. But they are not willing to surrender the republic to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is what the Taliban call their old regime.
Absolutely, yeah. So the republic so far is the red line, but again, they are open to making hard compromises and trade-offs. Now, engaging in peace is unconditional, but peace itself would be conditional.
Sure. Ambassador Neumann, you must have seen the op-ed by former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley and former and former Deputy Secretary of Defense Michel Flournoy, which said that that the peace process should not be given up for dead, but instead we should try and salvage it. And basically, the process so far focused on the Taliban's concerns, which basically meant how to sort of ensure that there's a withdrawal that satisfies the Taliban. But now the next round of talks, and there have already been 9 rounds, that the next rounds of talks should focus on things like the ceasefire, on the future of Afghanistan, and on assurances that the Taliban do not want to recreate their Islamic Emirate. Do you think that is the way forward? And is it even feasible? Because are the Taliban thinking that we engaged in this process so far, but the rug was pulled from underneath us, and therefore maybe we cannot trust further rounds of talks, or they will continue to negotiate?
Oh, I think they will continue to negotiate. They will continue to fight. And frankly, I think we have to be prepared to do the same. I didn't disagree so much with the Hadley-Flournoy article, but I think it has the same problem that a great many op-eds I see are having. They say, we must get out of Afghanistan, we must do so responsibly, and to do that we have to negotiate. And then they stop when they get to the hard, without getting to the hard question, which is, okay, how are you going to do that?
And what are you going to negotiate over?
What are you going to do if it doesn't work? And so I think the answer to that has to be that to me, you keep the channel of negotiation open because it's you fight. You keep the channel open not because you have a lot of faith in it, but because it is much easier to pick up an ongoing process. Politically, it's very hard to start once you stop. It's just like pulling your ambassador out of the country. Then you have to justify why things have changed so much that you can start again. If you have a peace process and you haven't physically stopped it, you can always generate something. I'm a little less negative than Bill. That may be a function of character rather than the facts on the ground. My friend Robert Ford once told me that if I showed me a dung heap, I'd tell him there was a flower. Possibly it's not real analysis, but I noticed one thing. Yes, every Democratic presidential candidate has some version of we want to end the war. But every one of them also has this responsibility line. Even Trump has said enough that talking to people in the White House, and you might be able to want to say something on that too, my sense is he really does want to get out, but he doesn't want a disaster. He doesn't want to preside over it. So I think it is quite possible that we will stick. Unfortunately, we will do it as we have done it for the last 18 years without clearly convincing anybody that we'll stick the next year. So that we will, year by year, make the decision to continue but not get the psychological benefit with our enemies or even our friends of persuading them that we will do this for long term. I would also say that while there's a great deal of grumpiness about Afghanistan, unquestionable, it's not on the top 10 of any of the issues almost any American's going to vote on. There's no movement in Congress to cut off funding. This is entirely within the president's will. If the president wants to bug out, he can do it. If the president wants to stay, there is no force out there which is apparent, which is going to push him out.
Another difference from Vietnam.
Another difference from Vietnam.
Not an issue that is on the daily evening news.
And the casualties are very low. I mean, that's a tragedy. You know, I've watched people die. I understand this problem, but we lost 12 people last year. We've lost 15 so far this year. We lost 80 last year in non-combat training incidents outside Afghanistan, and it costs somewhere around 2% of the defense budget. Now, that's real money. You could devote it to other things, and it's real loss of life, but it is at a level that is perfectly sustainable for our country if we choose politically to sustain it. And there is not now the political pressure that would drive the president out. The president may want out as a commitment to his base, but he is not facing some inexorable pressure. It's very difficult to see who would now vote for President. I mean, you have to ask yourself, who would now vote for President Trump who would not vote for him because he doesn't get out of Afghanistan? Where are those votes? They're not there. You know, those are on the other side anyway. So I think
there are people who will write op-eds that, you know, he didn't get out of Afghanistan, but I don't think that there will be anybody who will not vote for the president for not getting out of Afghanistan.
And the candidates on the Democratic side mostly have some version of, I want to be out by the end of my term. Well, so did President Obama twice, and you know, and so does President Trump. It's the bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, America has been in Afghanistan for 18 years, but it has also been talking about getting out for 14 of those 18 years. Yeah. Okay. Look,
that argument cuts both ways. There's it's easy to withdraw because someone's not going to, withdraw their vote.
Of course.
If the president wants out, he can do it.
It works either way. But look, I've always said, and I've written this several times, and I'm happy to repeat myself, that
We all are,
that
aren't
Afghanistan, the American involvement in Afghanistan faces a paradox. It would be easier for the US to get out by not making it a policy that it wants to get out. So the less you talk about getting out, and the more you signal to the Taliban and to the Pakistanis and to other Afghanistan neighbors, then America could stay there forever, or for a very long time. You may actually be able to get out earlier. The more they think, one more year,
We're always expressing haste. I mean, this is so funny.
the anxiety then makes the other side want to hedge.
It's almost a Western deformity, because I see it in the British and others too. You know, if negotiations are what you want, then you have to push them urgently. In fact, that's not true. They remind me of somebody who walks into the rug bazaar and says, "That's the finest carpet I've ever seen. I absolutely have to have it. I want your best price, and I have 15 minutes to bargain." It's going to be a very expensive rug. This is the way we bargain.
Yeah. You don't arrive and there say, you know, I've been seeing many good rugs today, and this one is not really half as good. But you know, I've got about $20 in my pocket for it, so let's talk.
Yeah.
Trump gave up the game by saying, I want to leave Afghanistan and I'm going to start withdrawing troops. I mean, how do you negotiate in that manner? We put all of our chips on the table and showed them our cards. And of course, the Taliban are able to stonewall. And when you're talking about the op-ed, right? I mean, that's fantasy. We're saying what we want. The Taliban is saying, absolutely not. We are not going to discuss the ceasefire. They've said repeatedly, we will not. There's an actual quote in an article written on Voice of Jihad where the Taliban says, we will not share power. I'm paraphrasing, but it's these words, for a silly ministerial post in the government. That's the Taliban's official position.
Well, and they've also talked about the revival of the Islamic Emirates.
And yes, absolutely. They use the word, we want an Islamic government. We, as the representatives of the Afghan
quotes are up
people.
there, by the way, for those who want to read the exact quotes.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is what the Taliban's telling us, and yet our policymakers are putting out a wish list of what we want and what we should demand of the Taliban when we've already put our cards on the table and said we want to leave. That's no way to conduct a negotiation.
Okay, but Bill, here's my question. Here's my question. Supposing somebody says, yeah, all of what you're saying is true, and there are people who say that. Stakes are not particularly high for the US. Explain to the audience and everybody who's watching why actually the Taliban getting the feeling of success will be a high price to pay. That it's not just about America losing and leaving, but actually the Taliban winning, I think, would be. I mean, I have my own argument, but since you're the guest, you go first and tell us why you think it's a very heavy price to pay, and there might be a heavier price down the road.
Well, I mean, first for the Afghan people, it'll be a horrible price to pay. I always say, we have the U.S. and the Taliban, or the West and the Taliban, have different notions of what peace is. To the United States, peace is we withdraw and the fighting ends. To the Taliban, peace means the U.S. withdraws and the Taliban settle scores and they restore the Islamic Emirate, and then there'll be peace. And that's going to be a lot of scores to settle. The human rights, we all know what the Taliban regime looked like prior to the U.S. invasion. So you're going to have, the heavy cost.
You don't believe in the reformed new Taliban?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, I could show you videos of them stoning women in areas of provinces or
even now
districts. Even today, in districts under their control.
Which they proudly announce themselves.
Yeah. They can't help themselves in showing their hand. They're at the point where they're just sort of gloating over all of this. So you have because I don't believe the Afghan government will be able to hold the South and the East. I mean, look at the fight. When you talk about where the elections were the problems in the election, these are occurring in areas where the Taliban should have by no right have strength. Up in the north area where Dostum and all of the Afghan warlords that have the capability. The fighting should not be happening, and yet that is happening in Afghanistan. It's one of the most hotly contested areas or provinces like Baghlan and Takhar and places like Samagan. These provinces 5 years ago had zero problems, so it speaks to the strength of the Taliban. Beyond that, to answer your question, you have Al-Qaeda will be justified in backing the Taliban, and the Taliban will be justified in not denouncing Al-Qaeda and not handing Osama bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda leaders who they were sheltering after 9/11. This would be a massive recruiting boon for Al-Qaeda when the Taliban achieve their victory.
We drove the Russians out.
Yep.
We drove the Soviets out. We have now driven the Americans out.
And
that
we
will be
can't-
the
we
bumper
can't
sticker.
discount
That
the
will be the
religious
Taliban
aspect.
bumper sticker. Of course, they can't put bumper stickers on the back of mules, but that's what they would like to have.
That would be forbidden, I'm sure, in their,
got a lot of our home
their
fees.
version.
Yes, they do.
But the religious motivation would be justified in not giving in to the superpower. It would be, so you'd have that recruiting boon. I think India probably, given Pakistan's validation in supporting the Taliban, you would see a reinvigoration of those jihadist groups that are backed by the Pakistani state, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the alphabet soup of Pakistani terrorist groups that are backed in order to fight in Kashmir. And elsewhere, remember Mumbai occurred far, far from Kashmir, as have other attacks in India. And then Al-Qaeda is not just confined to Afghanistan. Of course, it has a global network as well. It would be a very big draw, big recruiting boon for it. And that's something we have to be prepared for. I say if leaving Afghanistan is going to happen, we at least need to be honest about what we're going to leave behind, and we need to take responsibility.
Okay, I'll come back to you in a minute, Bill, with the question, and I'm giving the question right now, which is, what do you say to those who say, nah, we've come a long way since 9/11, we've built intelligence capabilities, we've got other ways, we'll be fine. So I want your answer to that in a bit, but before that, Javid, yeah, you said.
I just maybe wanted to close the loop on this one. I fully agree with Bill and Ambassador Neumann on this one. Look, the standard for victory in Afghanistan, or the American standard for victory in Afghanistan, was never that we could score an outright military win. And this has been happening since the Obama years. But instead, it was about when we can leave and then what we are going to leave behind, right? But the United States should at least have options between a good deal and a bad deal, right, if we're negotiating it. But what's been happening so far is that options has slowly moved from between a good deal and a bad deal to a bad deal and a worse deal, right? And that's dangerous. Now, on the price to pay for the Taliban, even if they agree, say, on some kind of a residual counterterrorism presence, or even if they don't agree on that one, just taking them by the assurances that they have provided so far to the United States, is that, look, many of you may have watched Game of Thrones. There's a really nice quote there, and it said that you cannot put a leash on a dog if you put a crown on his head. And what the U.S. Taliban deal did was essentially putting a crown on the Taliban's head. They're fully and completely unconcerned about the leash part. Now, whatever the leash is, that's second. The third point I wanted to make is that by any measure, the Afghan case, the Afghanistan of 2019 is a glass half full, right? Now, however you want to look at it. But it wouldn't matter if you end up throwing the glass away altogether, right? So you also have to think about the achievements. The achievements is not just the Afghan achievement, it's principally American achievements. The biggest one would be the Afghan security forces. That's your crowning achievement. You've built it. You've spent treasure in human sacrifice on.
And the Afghan forces are the ones that have been bearing the brunt of fighting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Now, Bill, answer the question that I asked.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you say to those who say we have a superior intelligence capability, we know what everybody is doing, we can do that, and so therefore we are not going to be caught unaware like we were on 9/11?
I'll just give you an example of why that's, I'll say, nonsense.
Nonsense is a pretty respectable word, you can say.
Okay, yeah, well, I had some pretty unrespectable words.
In this day and age, a lot of words have become respectable that weren't respectable before, but nonsense is fine.
Yeah, so in 2015, October 2015, United States military paired with Afghan security forces raided an 2 al-Qaeda training camps in a district called Shorabak in Kandahar province. One of these facilities was 30 square miles. It housed al-Qaeda's propaganda unit, Sahab. It had all kinds of equipment. It was a training center, command and control center. We know that Sahab was actually there because we knocked them out for a year after this raid. The United States didn't just find this because of excellent intelligence gathering capabilities. They discovered it 6 months earlier in a raid in Burma in Pakistan. Paktika province in northeastern Afghanistan. They conducted a raid, they killed a senior al-Qaeda leader, and they came across information that had, that was telling them that this was there. Then they go ahead and put the ISR, the intelligence gathering assets. They see this, they plan and conduct a raid. That was boots on the ground that led them to intelligence to conduct this raid. If the United States withdraws from Afghanistan, there will be no counterterrorism forces left behind. The Taliban has been very clear that they said in a recent statement, if one American soldier, and they consider the CIA to be American soldiers, is on the ground in Afghanistan, we will fight to our last breath to eject him. So there will not be counterterrorism forces. Now, keep in mind, this district in Shorabak at the time was Taliban controlled, right? So this was the Taliban permitted al-Qaeda to run these 2 training camps there. And by the way, the general said this was the largest al-Qaeda camp that we had seen since 9/11. Not the largest al-Qaeda camp they'd seen in Afghanistan since 9/11, but throughout the world. So this is what's happening in Afghanistan. It's happening today. We're only seeing pieces of this because it's not being picked up in the media.
Boots on the ground are necessary,
are necessary.
even for the longer-term homeland security exercise of denying international terrorists space for organization of a global terrorist.
And you can't trust the Taliban to do this. I mean, the same people that, again, that called al-Qaeda a dark slap on the face of the United States.
You couldn't trust many others as well, other than the Taliban. And after all, al-Qaeda people have cropped up in other places.
There's another aspect too which we need to bring in, and that is the Islamic State, ISIS, which is now in Afghanistan, and which has been strong enough to maintain itself despite attacks by both the United States, Afghan forces, and the Taliban. And I found it very strange that probably 95% or more of the editorials written after the Camp David collapse talked about peace with the Taliban as though there were no Islamic State issue. It's like, don't look at that one. That's hard. I think this is particularly important because there are a lot of indications that if we leave, it doesn't mean that al-Qaeda, the Taliban just win a war quickly. And frankly, if you have a breakdown of some of the Afghan forces in the south and east, you're very likely to have those in the north fighting, along with others, and you're very likely to go to a civil war. In a civil war, there will be more space for the Islamic State, space to regroup after Iraq and Syria, more space for al-Qaeda, as well as the Taliban. So I think it's really important that Americans understand that just getting out does not mean, we get out, Taliban win, tough for some Afghan women, but the world goes on. No, it means space for al-Qaeda, it means space for the Islamic State, it means room to grow.
Space for new groups, what I call Jihad 3.2. I mean, it's not just about al-Qaeda and ISIS. You didn't know that ISIS existed between 2008 and 2011 when it manifested itself, so there might be some others.
It's a very heavy potential price to get out.
If I may, if there was one thing you could trust the Taliban to conduct counterterrorism operations, it would be against the Islamic State. They hate each other.
Yeah, but they haven't won.
They haven't, and I think there's a reason for this. I think it's I'm sorry if I give examples. I believe it was...
We like examples, don't worry.
2 years ago, the Islamic State took over a district, and it just started, it did Taliban times 10, right? It was beheading people and torturing. The Afghan military and the U.S. military at the time couldn't do anything about it. So the Taliban said, all right, enough of that. They organized, they massed about 1,000 fighters and wiped the Islamic State out of this district in Georgetown. Killed 250 fighters, captured another 150, and then about 300 of them defected to the Afghan government. Believe it or not, the Afghan military, which couldn't do anything about the fighting there, was able to evacuate them to another area, bring in planes, and meanwhile, all the civilians are complaining about how they never had any help. But that being said, when the Taliban puts their mind to it, they'll eliminate the Islamic State.
Well,
the Islamic State has a small presence.
They've tried in
I don't believe they've really tried because they have bigger fish to fry in the moment in Afghanistan.
In any event,
that's getting the U.S. to withdraw, and that's defeating the Afghan government. And then once they're ready, they're going to turn their guns because the Islamic State really is based primarily in Nangarhar province.
I hope
they've
you're
wiped
right.
them out in other districts.
I hope you're right, but subcontracting our fight with the Islamic State to a terrorist group.
Believe me,
wouldn't be my first preference.
It's not. I don't think that's an argument to conduct a peace deal.
I didn't think
That's like the FBI handing over sort of fighting the Soprano family to the sort of,
I just happen to think in this instance, the Islamic State is a third order threat inside Afghanistan. It's actually one the Taliban will solve for us, but it doesn't solve any problem because you still have the Taliban that backs
Javid, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of add to these. I mean, we have seen terrorism from the Taliban. We just don't know how their counterterrorism is going to look like. But I mean, I fully agree that so some of the things that's been said here is that you cannot actually outsource your CT operations to a group that you've been fighting against for the last 18 years, right? One. The second on this relationship between the Islamic State and the Taliban is that in many ways, their relationship is like it's like two scorpions in a bottle. Very territorial, very deadly, very sort of turfy and lethal, right? But in other cases, they're also, when you look at the composition of the Islamic State Khorasan province itself, their senior leaders have been basically renegade Taliban members who are disaffected, who says that, you know what, we don't like this, because they were pushing for a military victory, or they were disgruntled for other reasons, maybe some kind of sort of differences, subterranean rivalries with their leadership, and then they said, we're going to defect to the Islamic State, or operate under a different umbrella and a different flag, and that's exactly what happened. So we don't know. This case, if you're in Afghanistan right now, is that when who is Islamic State and who is Taliban, right? It could be sort of like a little bit of both. Same group.
I'm about to open the discussion to the audience. So before that, some final comments, each one of you. Ambassador Neumann, a little bit more on what do you think should be the American negotiating posture, and what should be the outlook, including concerns about getting the Afghan government to behave a little bit better on issues such as corruption, etc. What would you draw as the list of priorities for the Americans?
At the end of the day, if you want peace in Afghanistan, it has to be made between Afghans. The United States cannot negotiate a peace that Afghans will live by without the Afghans. Therefore, the government has to be part of the peace talks. I think that's going to be a long time coming. My conclusion is if you want that, as I think we must, then you have to be prepared to stay for a long time. And therefore, this goes back to your point about not rushing. I think the issue now is to, if you will, downsize to the smallest sustainable presence that we can maintain for a long time, and say that's what you're doing. You're not downsizing as a first step to leaving. You're sizing for the things that are most critical to preventing a Taliban victory, particularly the air power, commandos, some of the training for the Afghans, and we'll have help from NATO, remember, we're not alone. And you want to get the budget down a little bit, and then you want to say, but that's it. That's where we're, there will be people who say, oh no, that's the first step. But I think if you want to stay believe you have to stay, not want to stay, believe you have to stay for the long term in order to have a chance at either peace through negotiation or peace through growing the Afghan government to the point of strength that it can enforce that, then you have to say that we're sizing ourselves for a long-term sustainable presence, not for some short-term bump.
Okay, Bill.
Yeah, don't disagree with what Ambassador Neumann said, except that, again, I would reiterate that I think it's folly just to negotiate with the Taliban. I don't believe they're a partner that can be credibly negotiated with. They're not going to participate in the Afghan government. They don't believe in democracy. But the United States, throughout this entire war in Afghanistan, has just refused to deal with the real problem in this fight, and which is Pakistan and Pakistan's support for the Taliban. The Taliban would be a shell of itself without the safe haven provided and the support provided by the Pakistani state. And the U.S. has made zero effort to punish the Pakistani state for that. We still treat them. They're still a major non-NATO major ally. All of the things. I believe there's levers the U.S. could start pulling that don't include military force to influence Pakistan to try to change its behavior. Just cutting off money that we provided billions of dollars for over a decade and a half, it's not enough. You got to make individuals within the Pakistani state, within their military and their intelligence service, pay a price for what they're doing. You need to name names, stop them from travel, freeze their bank accounts. There's a whole host of options, all the way from pulling the major non-NATO ally status, or even consider listing Pakistan as a state sponsor of terror. That's how it's acted over these years.
Ambassador Neumann spoke about 9 policies towards Afghanistan. There's probably been 18 towards Pakistan in the last 18 years.
No, I think it's been one, and it's been one of appeasement.
Okay, that's an interesting take. I mean, the problem that comes from is the view especially in Foggy Bottom, that we have more at stake with Pakistan than just Afghanistan, and so maybe that kind of comes in between.
And I understand, but I mean, either Afghanistan is important or it's not. Either Pakistan's a state sponsor of terrorism or it's not. There's other allies in the region that the United States possibly should be looking to strengthen relations with. One very large one that happens to be an enemy of the Pakistani state. I think we've been backing the wrong horse in the region for the last 3 decades now, and it's time for a major shift in U.S. policy in South. Now, unfortunately, that and a unicorn and a pony, this stuff isn't going to happen. There's no will for this here in D.C., but if people were serious about dealing with it, because Afghanistan is just a symptom of the Pakistani state, right? And if we were serious about dealing with the terror issues in South Asia and beyond, Pakistan is one of the major nodes that needs to be taken out.
Javid.
First, a few things about the Taliban. Look, we're dealing with a very sort of fickle counterparty in peace here, the Taliban. And my understanding is from studying the Taliban for the past years is that I don't think that the Taliban leadership have settled yet on an idea of a compromise. I also don't know whether these Taliban leaders know what kind of compromise they could potentially embrace, that they could sell it to the entire movement, right? And they have also done very little to prepare the entire movement, the entire Taliban movement, for a settlement. And I'm talking about just a settlement, not even a peace settlement, because those are 2 different things. Now, when you look at their internal and public messaging, the Taliban, they're not conciliatory. It's not conciliatory to their fighters or to the Afghan public at large. They're mainly focused on this victory narrative, and they're sort of propagating that very, very actively. That's because inside the movement, the Taliban's leaders' main audience is their hardliners. And they have completely marginalized the moderates and the centrists in the peace talks. And the hardliners are the ones that are pushing for a military victory. And that's why I think if and when the peace talks resume again, I think the Taliban need to engage in their own intra-Taliban dialogue and then reach some kind of a intra-Taliban settlement first before they start engaging with the Afghan government and the Afghan polity at large. That's one. Now, what can the United States do in the meantime? Just a couple quick things. One is that we need to realize that withdrawal and disengagement have costs. right? And we need to deal with them very, very openly. If the United States continue to be at the center of brokering a peace deal in Afghanistan, then obviously it's going to own it, whether that deal succeeds or it fails, right? But in the end, no deal will be perfect for either side, not for the United States, not for the Afghans, not for the Taliban, or any of the regional countries that are party to the conflict. But we should be focused on negotiating deal that is, at the very least, sort of resemble some kind of a peaceful stalemate, right? Similar to what we have with respect to the military stalemate right now. Now, we need to focus less and less on securing a paper agreement itself, and then most on what the post-deal implementation will look like, right? And that's where basically the ultimate success or failure of the deal is going to show itself. And finally, I think the United States also need to start thinking about some of the contingencies, right? The plan Bs and Cs, even if the plan B and the C is to get the plan A right.
Okay, we've got a lot to chew on, all kinds of perspectives and a lot of information, including the hard information about how the Taliban view things, which we have not really seen much in our mainstream media. In particular, there's just been this whole discussion about, we are on the verge of a deal. No discussion of how the Taliban are actually describing it or seeing it. I think some interesting facts from Bill on that. We didn't talk much about what needs to be done on the non-Taliban side of Afghans. They also need to get their act together. President Ghani or whoever gets elected in this election, if it's somebody other than him, they really need to have some reconciliation on that part as well, because Afghanistan is not just Taliban, non-Taliban, but there are many other factors as well. So that needs to be done as well. But basically, that's the general picture. I think the consensus among the participants here seems to be that peace talks which do not lead to peace are not necessarily worthwhile, that messaging the Taliban that we are just anxious to get out is not a good idea, and that the regional factor of who sponsors or provides safe haven to Taliban is also an important one. I think those are the things that we all kind of agree upon. Questions. I would rather not say that this is also open to comments, because that might result in speeches, but if you can somehow be succinct and reduce your comment to something like a 140-character tweet length remark, you are more than welcome to make it. Questions are things that end with a question mark, so they must be very clear about what the question is. Introduce yourself first. Let's start right here.
Yes, David Isby, Ambassador. Thank you, David Isby. Ambassador Haqqani, we were talking about just a few moments ago, as Javid talked about how the Taliban sees this. I will ask you, how does what is the Pakistani military seeing this? Obviously, they are, while there is the vote as to how much leverage they do have, it's undeniably there. What are they looking for in their agreement, and what do they want as a future, and what would they be required to get Afghans talking to other Afghans?
I thought I had spent the last 18 years making it very, very clear that the one thing I don't speak for is the Pakistani military. And so you're asking me what they think. I personally think that the Pakistani military would like some kind of a settlement that would stop draining Pakistan in terms of having to remain engaged in Afghanistan militarily. And so they really want the US to withdraw as well. I think that there are elements there who wouldn't mind a Taliban victory. And I think that's why they facilitated the talks as they did, because the way the talks were going, the Taliban-Pakistani position was good. This is all agree. And none of the things that were uncomfortable for the Taliban or the Pakistani side even came up during the negotiations, which is one of the reasons why those who criticized the negotiating process criticized it as much as they did, because I think there are at least 3 of us have been very critical, and that's what we were critical about, that what you're doing is essentially you're handing So Pakistanis were being given a reward for bringing the Taliban to the talks. The Taliban were being given a reward for talking. And the Afghan public and the Afghan government were totally being bypassed, and some would say being thrown under the bus. But that's what they wanted. Answer to your question, the Pakistani military. I think eventually the Pakistan military would like a government in Afghanistan that is more pliable to their ambitions and aspirations. They couch it in terms of they want a government that is not beholden to India, but so far they have never been able to give convincing evidence of Afghanistan being used against Pakistan by India. Yes, sir. Right here, the young man. Introduce yourself and then the question.
My name is Wahab Kamal. My question is for Mr. Javid Ahmad.
Well, what do you do? Just introduce yourself. You're a student?
I'm a student at George Mason. Okay. During the time of Hamid Karzai, we used to hear that maybe the Afghan government should try a little harder to seek a dialogue or negotiate with the Taliban. When Ashraf Ghani came in, he did try that, maybe a little too hard with Gulbuddin Hikmatyar and inviting the Taliban for peace talks several times. So in your opinion, do you think there's anything the Afghan government can do politically that they haven't tried already before?
Yeah, go ahead. Once the question is directed at you, answer it.
Absolutely. First of all, the Afghan government, now that the elections are done, they could create a bit more sort of stronger political consensus with respect to engaging in direct talks with the Taliban. They could sort of reunify the Afghan political leaders and other sort of non-Taliban forces to start speaking with one voice with the Afghan government. I think President Ghani or whoever is elected or re-elected in the election should also stick with the current unconditional peace offer that President Ghani has offered to the Taliban and stick by it and then reinforces. They understand very well that their position in the peace talks is not a fixed position and that they're completely open to making very hard compromises and trade-offs. The Taliban need to start sort of reciprocating as well and then showing that they are willing to engage and show their seriousness in good faith by if not by declaring a national ceasefire, then at least some kind of a de-escalation of violence or ease up on their propaganda. But yes, there's a number of things that the Afghan could do, and I think with the elections results, once the election results are announced, you will see more and more of those.
Although the election results could also result in some kind of a political mess, but
we'll get
so far, we'll come to it when the mess comes.
Could I add one thing?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I think I totally agree with all that. Yeah. I think it's very important to understand a very difficult dynamic that the next Afghan government is going to have, whether it's Ghani or Abdullah. If you negotiate with a very small group, everybody outside criticizes. You have no constituency to support the agreement. If you negotiate with a big group, then everything leaks and everybody opposes before you have the agreement. In addition, Ghani has governed more and more with a rather small Eastern Pushtun group, and Abdullah has campaigned essentially with an ethnic non-Pushtun group. So whoever comes to power is going to have the problem that in order to negotiate from strength and to have an agreement that would hold, if that's ever possible, they have to have a broader base than they have used for the election. And there is one other dimension in Afghanistan. If you broaden your base, people want a price. They want jobs. They want assignments. Not always for people that are qualified. So if you pay too much price, you lose control of your government. If you don't bring them in, you don't have a government that can both negotiate and make the peace. I'm not saying this is not solvable. I think it is, but it will be this challenge of how to broaden the government while retaining control is going to be a major issue once we settle the election. They settle the election, you figure out who's president.
Ambassador Neumann, isn't that a problem in virtually all democracies now, that to get elected, you sometimes polarize effectively to be able to win?
Yeah, but there's a different dimension because when you broaden in, I remember at one point when Ghani was offering a particular post to one political opponent, the rumor was, pretty good rumor, that the person said, yes, but I need 50 jobs, and of course I'm going to pick who gets them, and you're going to pick people, some of whom might be good and some of whom probably are going to be the most corrupt, disgusting people you could have, and that undermines your government. So your problem is, how do you
reconcile while at the same time maintaining good governance?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I
right in the
say
middle.
one quick thing?
Sure.
I think just to add
You
to
asked
this,
an interesting
one is that President Ghani is capable of extreme pragmatism in this case, right? He engaged the Afghan bickering in incompetent political elites to the extent it was possible, and then when they started competing, pursuing their competing peace agendas, he started to leave them off, and then they failed. They failed miserably. That's one. The second is that the problem is that the Afghan political elites, or the non-Taliban forces, they will go against any system, now the current system or the future system, unless that system does not handsomely reward their participation. Right? And we have seen this. But what these leaders refuse to recognize is that their participation needs to come with certain degree of responsibility, accountability, and then some kind of principles, right? But that does not exist right now because no one has taken that responsibility yet. And because a large majority of the Afghan leaders are concerned more and more with managing power than managing country, and that needs to change. And I don't think President Ghani is the only person that could actually change that.
Hey, thank you all for coming. My name is Fatma Salman. I'm with the Atlantic Council. And my question is really to in an effort to de-link Afghanistan with Pakistan, could you also talk about other regional actors? It was alluded to earlier, India, China, Russia. How can they, or have they played a role in this? And just to answer the question too, what's next for Afghanistan peace talks? Who is looking to jump on the American withdrawal? If you could speak to the regional actors and stakeholders. Thank you.
Real quickly around, China has an interest because it worries about Chinese insurgents from Afghanistan, and it has become more sympathetic to asking Pakistan to be helpful in peace, but it has never been willing to use its relationship with Pakistan as pressure. So it will speak, and it speaks much more actively, but it doesn't really do anything. The Russians and the Iranians have both, if you look at a sort of 10, 15-year span, have reversed field. The Russians actually were very helpful to us for quite a period when we went in. Actually, the Iranians were quite helpful in the initial negotiations at Bonn in the formation of a government. What has, skipping over 15 years of history, but what has primarily happened is that both of them have looked and they see our position weakening, they see our will weakening, they see the Islamic State growing, and it scares them. And so they're prepared to deal with the Taliban, not because they think it will win or because they like it, but because they think it will be necessary to prevent the Islamic State from growing and becoming a threat. So that you now have the two of the major players, Iran and Russia, in fact, having somewhat cooperative relations with the Taliban. What was the other piece? India. Yeah. India is very difficult because India supports the Afghan government. We have usually tried to hold India at arm's length because the Pakistanis are absolutely paranoid about India. They may illustrate the old joke, that even paranoids have real enemies. But in any event, our position has usually been that if you bring the Indians in, the Pakistani reaction is going to be so over the top in terms of fear and help for the Taliban that you shouldn't do it. So India has been helpful in aid, they've been helpful in non-lethal assistance, they've given some helicopters, I think, but generally they have not joined. At one point they built a road with some armed security from Iran up through Nuristan, up through, not Nuristan, up into Helmand. But generally they've stayed out.
And involving them militarily is something that neither the United States nor the other NATO allies want.
Nobody
because
wants.
it would not be conducive to stability, because it will only provoke Pakistan further. Further questions? I'm going to ask 2 or 3 people to ask questions. Yeah, please go ahead.
My name's Ian Wilkie. I'm an international lawyer, U.S. Army veteran, and a keen student of South Asian affairs, having spent a lot of time there. I wonder if, my question's for the 2 diplomats, and I wonder if you agree with me that the team that the United States has been employing to conduct diplomacy now with the Taliban is ill-suited for the mission, insofar as, particularly not Khalilzad, who we talk about the most, but Robin Raphael, who is as close to an ISI ally that could exist in a United States diplomat. And I wonder whether or not putting both Raphael and Alice Wells in the driver's seat over there for such a long time has harmed our negotiating position, insofar as we now look like we don't have any more humanitarian principles, because we've placed women who are, on the one hand, calling for human rights across the table from the Taliban, whom we understand. Second part of my question would be, as regards Pakistan, what about the United States insisting, as part of our peace platform, that the Taliban must sever all links with the Pakistani intelligence service and the Pakistani military? So at least then we would have some actionable violations to act upon in the event that negotiations concluded with a U.S. withdrawal. Secondly, what if we insist that the Taliban renounce Al-Qaeda's sworn allegiance to them? That, to me, again, would give us some legal grounds, some justification for further strict measures as regards the Taliban in Pakistan. Thank you.
First of all, let me just say that on the first question, I think that it's for the American president to choose the team. I don't think Ambassador Raphael was part of the team that was negotiating with the Taliban this time. And she has been an honorable diplomat, as has Alice Wells. And we can all have our own individual preferences and criticisms about who is. We can disagree with people without necessarily sort of thinking of them as agents of evil. As far as as far as the second question is concerned, I think Ambassador Neumann may want to take that about.
Well, I do want to say the first. I agree with everything Hassan said, and of course these are people I know. Robin has been a friend for many years. But in fairness, no, she was not part of the interdelegation. In fact, you know, the way Ambassador Khalilzad negotiates is that nobody is really inner. Some people are more inner than others, but he plays his cards very close to his chest. He never tells anybody, including his bosses, as far as I've known him over the years, entirely what's going on. It's very much devotee of what the Duke of Wellington once expressed when he said that if my hat knew what my hair was thinking, I would throw away my hat. I mean, he just doesn't share. And that's part of his strength and sometimes part of his weakness. The idea that Alice Wells was the driving seat, I find, if Alice Wells has had a problem for the last some 9 months, a year, it's that she has no control over Ambassador Khalilzad, that he has a reporting chain totally outside her, and she has to scrimp and scrape to find out what's going on, and she accepted that when I talked to her right when he was nominated. She knew that from the beginning, but she thought he might have the political sway with the president to control the negotiation, so she accepted that price. But I just, as a matter of fact, she did not have that control. As to I think a number of the things you laid out on promises that we should have are correct. My problem is, what are promises worth? In 40 years of Afghan fighting, no agreement between any Afghan group and another has been maintained once the situation changed. Now, that's not purely Afghan. I mean, if you think of medieval and Renaissance Europe, it was true for the entire continent. So, you know, don't pick on the Afghans. But I think there is a problem with Americans. Americans tend to think of when you have an agreement, then you actually will have it implemented. And what you agree to is what happens. The problem with a great many agreements, not just in Afghanistan, is that you need verification, you need enforcement measures. There's almost no public discussion of that. Vietnam is an interesting parallel there. We actually had a pretty good verification mechanism in Vietnam. And we had an international commission. It's funny to remember that Iran was part of it under the Shah when they were an ally. And they were going around and they were pretty regularly documenting that the North Vietnamese were violating the agreement in all sorts of ways. But since the Americans had totally lost the political will to enforce it, and after Congress took away the money, they lost the capacity to enforce it, it didn't matter. But it's a very useful memory of it's not just what you want in promises. How are you going to know, and how are you going to enforce? And we could have a whole separate seminar on how difficult it's going to be to know. It's one of the huge problems. Just one example. If you have a sort of broad ceasefire, no violence, whatever, and the Taliban proceed to assassinate the odd district official, to expand little by little the areas in which you don't have an altogether outright clash, but they dominate and influence. At what point are you going to be able to even say that's Taliban, to have a case that allows the Americans to strike back? So we throw out these things about enforcement, and I think half the time we have absolutely no idea what we're talking about.
There's tremendous deniability in a country like Afghanistan. People can say, oh, that was a tribal feud, had nothing to do with us, etc. You will have so many of those. And of past Afghan agreements, I have some experience going back to my role in Afghan government, in Pakistan's government. And I remember one particular agreement this was the so-called Islamabad Accord between the various Mujahideen parties after the collapse of the Najibullah government. And all of these leaders were brought to Makkah to swear that they will not violate it. And of course, after that, one of the parties complained that their man or their leader, who had been designated Prime Minister of Afghanistan, was not being allowed to come back to Kabul. So I had the duty to ask the other side, why are you not allowing him? You're violating the agreement. And they turned around and said, God be our witness, we are not violating the agreement. We agreed that he is the Prime Minister of Afghanistan, and by God, he is the Prime Minister of Afghanistan. Where does it say in the agreement that the Prime Minister of Afghanistan will be able to enter the city of Kabul? So that is a complex level of argumentation that we will have to face once we have an agreement, if we have an agreement.
If I may.
Sure.
I think we should be questioning Ambassador Khalilzad. In July 2016, I testified to Congress alongside Ambassador Khalilzad, and the subject was Pakistan, friend or foe in the war on terror, right? And he led off. And his statements were exactly what I was going to say. He called the Pakistan a state sponsor of terrorism. He said the Taliban al-Qaeda alliance was enduring and that the Taliban would never denounce al-Qaeda. On and on, to the point where I literally discarded my verbal testimony and said, he's absolutely right. And I'm going to explain, I'll give you some details as to why this is correct, because there's no need for me to repeat myself or to repeat what he said. 2 years later, he's appointed the special representative, and he says that he praises Pakistan for its support with peace. He's telling journalists that the Taliban is going to break with al-Qaeda. What happened in 2 years? I mean, I'm a person, that, if you make a statement on the congressional record, you should be held to that account. I mean, I think character and honor still should mean something in this day and age. And there's something not right with what Ambassador Khalilzad is doing. And this is why if any deal that is being made, if it is signed, it should be disclosed to the American public, because something is not right there. And
At least his hat should know.
I think
nobody
I like that quote.
Yeah. Okay, who else? Yes, young man in the middle.
Thank you for fitting my question in. My name is Miles Crawford. I work at a strategic communications firm just a couple blocks away from here. So I would like to just direct my question to the talks themselves. The last 6 rounds or so were held in Doha, in Qatar. There's any number of ways of criticizing the talks themselves. We were just talking about the ambassador. What insights can we glean from the location of the talks? There was one held in the UAE, I think back a year ago, and what sort of geopolitics are going on, not only between the U.S. and the Taliban parties themselves, but between the host nation Qatar, Qatar, and then additionally there was the Moscow talk or summit held between the Afghan government and the Taliban a year ago. So if you could speak to those issues, thank you.
Does anyone want to comment on that?
On Qatar hosting the negotiations, I mean, that should be a major red flag to begin with, given its support for terrorist groups. You had Guantanamo Bay detainees who are part of the negotiating committee. Some of these individuals are the Taliban's negotiating committee, of course, who are mass murderers, are major human rights violators. And Qatar is now letting these individuals tour the world in order, now that negotiations have collapsed. They've been in Russia, I believe they were in China recently. I'm sorry, what's up?
Iran, too.
Iran, yeah, right. So the United States, by allowing Qatar to set up that political office, which remember, was not supposed to be a political office. The Taliban were not supposed to fly their flag.
That was just for the talks.
It was just supposed to be for peace talks, and now you have them traversing the globe, just increasing the legitimacy of the Taliban and decreasing the legitimacy of the Afghan state. Remember, the Afghan government has been shut out of this because the Taliban has said it refuses outright. It will not. Here's what they call the Afghan government: puppets, impotent, the Kabul administration, stooges of the West. I could go on and on. This is littered in their public statements, again, in 5 languages throughout. This is how they view the Afghan government, and yet we're given the Taliban carte blanche to use this political office in Qatar to conduct its business. After these talks were ended, that office should have been shuttered, or at the very least, those individuals should not be allowed to traverse the globe as they've been doing.
Can I say a few things?
Yep, sure, Javid.
And I think this question fits into the question about sort of what the regional countries' objectives are with respect to the peace talks. One, Qatar's bona fides are unknown. It's also something that the Afghan government, to the degree that I know, are not very sort of pleased.
Does Qatar have an embassy in Kabul?
They just sent an ambassador.
Okay.
Because
they didn't for the last 17 years.
No. But the Afghan government had an embassy in Doha. Now, also China. So it goes back to the question on the region. China is that China has long pursued a very sort of non-interventionist role in policy in Afghanistan. And they have maintained very close ties with the Taliban. They have hosted them many times, as Bill said as well. And in general, Chinese messages, public and in private, are quite peace sort of seeking. But China also has very close ties with Pakistan, of course. And so they have to consider that as well when it comes to the Afghan peace talks. But overall, I think China wants to facilitate the talks and be sort of a neutral convener, or at least be seen like that, rather than be playing an active role in mediating it, for example. But the other important thing is that this I wanted to talk about was this Russia, Iran, Pakistan triangle. I mean, enough was said about the Pakistan part, but the Russia-Iran component is also very important, because when it comes to Afghanistan, the Russians and the Iranians see Afghanistan strictly from a U.S. prism. Right? Now, first in Russia, I mean, of course, their concern is ISIS in the north, and they have disagreement on ISIS's threats as well, including the scope, the extent of the threats, its sources, its capabilities, its intentions. They're also very openly hedging on certain Afghan leaders, and who are mainly those who openly criticize the United States, right? People like former President Karzai. And this is to promote their priorities, Russian priorities. And those priorities are, on the one hand, to both create and pursue a parallel Moscow-led peace process, but also at the same time create a battle of legitimacy for President Ghani or any other president in the future that the Russians don't like. Iran, on the other hand, their leaders don't seem to trust the Taliban, but they also don't trust the Afghan government that much, largely because of its very sort of openly pro.
I think they don't trust, period.
Yeah. I mean, you could say that, yeah, exactly. But they have, and it's also because in this government, at least under President Ghani, they don't trust him largely because President Ghani's close ties with the Saudi Arabians. And he had several trips there. So what we have seen in recent months and years, that IRGC, for example, their personnel reportedly fighting alongside the Taliban. They're close to 400 advisors, IRGC and the Quds Force, that are fighting alongside elements within the Taliban
GCC
as well.
nationals. You're not talking about GCC as state.
No,
The
IRGC.
IRGC.
Yes. That's why I got lost.
And then their sort of special forces,
Yeah,
the Quds Force. And we've seen this, and it's largely, they've also empowered the Taliban in Western Afghanistan, in Farah and in Herat province, to prevent the construction of hydroelectric dam, for example, that would restrict the flow of Afghan water to Iran, and Iran has problems, water problems. So there's a huge displacement of Iranian nationals in eastern Iran to other parts of the country, largely because of the water issue. So Iran even allowed the Taliban to open an office in Mashhad. So there's a Mashhad Shura, that's been operating there since 2014. And I can tell you that the Iranian trained snipers, it's called Dragunov, are the most effective snipers that the Taliban have. They even fight alongside the Taliban Red units, which is their special forces unit. And so they're notorious for their effectiveness. So finally, I would say that Iran will be open to sort of a future government in Kabul, as long as it includes more of those sort of traditional patrons, or clients, sorry, not patrons, clients and partners, mostly Shia leaders in Hizb Wahdat and Hizb Islami, not Hizb Islami, but Jamaat Islami, that is long supported. And with respect to the U.S., if there's anywhere where Iran can stick it up to the United States, it will be in Afghanistan, and they're already doing it.
Two really quick points. One, I'm a little more friendly to Qatar than Bill is. I think, first of all, it's important to remember we asked them to take on the Guantanamo hostages, that they didn't rush forth. A lot of what they've done at our behest. And we often ask them to do more. And they are also, of course, the host to our largest base and command and control in the area at El Udeid, and probably they're certainly more reliable than the Saudis because they need us in order to protect them, not necessarily more reliable out of the goodness of their heart. But they are an ally in many ways, and they have strong differences in other ways, and that's sort of our history across the Middle East.
I think that whole Gulf controversy, I think, would consume our.
Yeah, no, we're not going there. I promise.
We are just not going there.
But I do want to say,
the point
Rafel is not, and I defended Robin, but I realized that I did not say very clearly. Robin was very unfairly maligned by the FBI raiding her house and doing a leak, which she could not.
Cleared.
And she was totally cleared, and the FBI dropped all charges. Yes. They pursued nothing.
Yes, thank you for pointing
that out. And I think that is important to note, because
in this day and age, sometimes charges are remembered. Somebody being cleared of the charges is forgotten. So it's important.
Mark Twain said, a lie will get halfway around the world before truth gets its pants on.
But that said, people can, diplomats can have a political view or a position that should not always be interpreted as if somebody's, like I have said that in Pakistan hundreds of times without any effect. that, just because I support a closer relationship between Pakistan and the United States and between Pakistan and India does not mean I'm either an American agent or an Indian agent. The same should apply in reverse. Well, on that note, I think we can end this discussion. We have really covered a lot of ground, but there's still always a lot more ground.
So is it all clear now?
Nothing's clear.
It's mud.
But I think we all know the situation a little bit better. Let us all hope that the peace process, if it does move forward, results in peace, not just a deal that is not implementable or is not fully implemented, and that whatever comes next means an improvement in the lives of the people of Afghanistan who have suffered enough over the last 40 years. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, and thank you very much to the panel.
Thank you.
Good to meet you.
It was a good panel.
I think we covered all ground.